Hi, I'm Dennis, and in this video I will show you how I made this strawberry poison dart frog on a monstera leaf with the Shapeoko, using a special technique with vertical instead of the conventional horizontal tabs to hold the stock in place during the carving process. I downloaded this frog from TurboSquid, but its pose was rather static, and a few toes of the front feet were positioned underneath the body, which would be impossible to reach by the router bit from above. So I changed it into a more dynamic pose and repositioned its feet with Meshmixer. I also purchased this monstera plant on CG Trader and virtually cut off one of its leaves to place it underneath the frog. But the frog has a perfectly flat bottom, whereas the leaf has an irregularly shaped top surface, and the feet of the frog do not touch the leaf, making it look as if the frog is hovering above it. So I altered the frog's feet and toes to make them touch the leaf surface, and also bent the very tips of the leaf down and gave it some thickness. Looking at it from above, the frog didn't seem to have any sides where I could place the horizontal tabs to secure it when routing. The toes were too fragile, and its head and butt were spaced at opposite ends along the z-axis. So I decided to add vertical tabs to the bottom of its feet that pointed downwards, into the leaf. If I made these tabs long enough, I could also use them later to precisely position the frog onto the leaf so that the bottom side of its feet would exactly follow the contours of the leaf surface. For this, I created pockets in the leaf and also left a shallow imprint of the frog's feet. With such thin front legs, I figured that it would be best to add 2 more vertical tabs to its body that I would remove later after the carve. All the tabs had a conical shape with a sloping angle of 5 degrees, as I plan to use tapered bullnose bits with a 3.6 degree angle. Obviously, such bits are unable to carve perfectly square vertical angles. A design like this, with vertical tabs on the bottom side, meant that I would have to carve it with the bottom up first, then flip it upside down and secure it in place using the vertical tabs to carve the top side. Since there would be no place for dowel holes, the only way I could retain the X and Y positions of the stock before and after this flip would be by creating a platform, with holes for the vertical tabs, and making sure that the X, Y and Z boundaries of both the frog and the platform would be identical by adding reference pillars on the corners, so that I could leave the 0 coordinates of the CNC untouched during the carves. The theory behind this may become clear later on in this video, where you will see the sequential steps I went through to carve the frog on both sides with the platform carve in between. Now I feel like I've seen this frog somewhere before, I just can't remember where. I plan to use a big slice of a tree trunk for the leaf and a bifurcated branch for the frog. I'll get back to the frog later. Let's get started with the leaf first. I used VCarve to create the roughing pass and the finishing pass. Since the slice was too thick to fit in between the CNC bed and the Z gantry, I cut off its sides so that I could lower it into the hole that I had created for the manual rotary setup and secure it in place in the metal frame. I used a 1-inch bit to shave off and flatten its surface on one side until it would fit underneath the gantry. I took it out of the frame, put the standard CNC bed in place and clamped the stock with its flattened side down to surface the other side until it was just over 50 mm thick. The wood had been eaten by several bugs, and I even found 2 woodworms still hiding in their tunnels after inspecting the surface. There were also a few deep cracks running from the core all the way to the edge. I didn't want to take the risk of the wood splitting mid-carve, so I cleaned out the holes and filled all the cracks and hollows with some epoxy resin, to which I added a little bit of jade-colored Stardust Mica powder. While the epoxy was solidifying, I started working on the frog. Carving the frog would be a 3-stage process, starting with the profile cut of the bottom side, followed by the roughing and finishing passes. Then cutting a platform with tab holes, and finally a profile cut of the top side, followed by the roughing and finishing passes. I then took that bifurcated branch, removed the bark with a screwdriver, cut it to size, and cleaned it up with a steel brush. I created a mold from MDF pieces that I covered in duct tape and glued all the panels together with a glue gun so that all gaps were sealed watertight, and kept the branch in place with a few drops of heat glue as well. I made 3 batches of colored epoxy resin. I first poured in blue, so most of this color would be on the bottom for the frog's feet. then a layer of purple as a transitional color, and topped it off with red. I didn't want the frog to end up with clearly separated horizontal layers, so I disturbed the layers with a few random swirls and let it solidify for several days. In the meantime, I continued working on the leaf. Since the contours of the leaf would very closely match the shape of the trunk slice, there wouldn't be much material to hold the stock in place when clamping it from the top. So I cut a spoil board from MDF, drilled holes in the corners to match those in the CNC bed, and drilled screw holes in 4 places to attach it to the stock. I determined the locations of the holes based on the design in VCarve, so that the holes for the CNC bed would not be underneath the leaf, and the stock attachment screws would not stick through an area that would fall outside the leaf's edge or end up in one of the leaf's holes. I also tried to center the pith of the trunk slice as close as possible to the place where the Monstra leaf sprouts from its stem, to let the growth rings expand proportionally to the edge of the leaf. Then clamped the two, flipped them upside down, and screwed them together. I no longer needed the cross lines that I had drawn on the spoil board to find the center and determine the locations of the holes, as I could now use the spoil board holes to find the mathematical center for the CNC carves. The roughing carve, for which I inserted a 3-inch long end mill from Amano tool, took a little over 18 hours. I swapped the roughing bit for a 1/8 conical ball-nose bit from Amano tool to complete the finishing carve. After the finishing carve was completed almost 7 hours later, I unscrewed the spoil board from the leaf and cut off the surplus wood with the bandsaw. I sanded the rough and sharp edges as well as some visible tracks that the bit had left in the wood with the Dremel, first using the sanding drum and then a flap wheel, and sealed it with a layer of varnish. By the time I was done with the leaf, the epoxy of the frog had solidified. I removed the cast from the mold and removed the ruffled glue sticking to the edge of the block with rough sanding paper for a flat bottom surface, so that I could flatten the top side with the CNC router and give it a uniform thickness. I flipped the stock upside down and inserted a 3-inch long roughing bit for a brief 10mm deep profile cut to remove the outside material and create space so that the stock could sink in the vertical tab holes later for the topside carve. I then used the same bit and CNC settings for the roughing carve of the bottom side. After the roughing carve was done, I swapped the end mill for a 3-inch long 1/16 tapered ball nose bit for the finishing carve. I cut a piece of MDF that would become the platform, attached it to the CNC bed, and used the same 1/16 tapered ball nose bit to carve the tab holes. I put a drop of glue in the holes, pushed the frog with its tabs into the holes, and inserted the same roughing bit that I had used before to carve the bottom side of the frog. For the following carves, it was critical to not change the X and Y 0 coordinates of the CNC setup, as the locations of the 6 tab holes in the platform were the reference points that ensured that the frog would be centered exactly at the X and Y 0 coordinates relative to the center of this platform. The first carve was a profile cut to remove the outer stock material, for which I left temporary horizontal tabs in place so that the pieces wouldn't be thrown around. After the profile carve, I cut the tabs with the Dremel and removed the outer stock material. I then proceeded with the roughing carve, using the same bit and without changing any of the 0 coordinates. Finally, I inserted the 1/16 tapered ball nose bit for the finishing carve. The only thing I needed to do was reset the 0 of the Z height. When the finishing carve was done, I unscrewed the platform from the CNC bed and cut the tabs with a flush cut saw. I removed only the two center tabs, as the vertical tabs under the feet would go into the holes in the leaf. After polishing the frog with the flap wheel, I finished it off with clear varnish to increase the contrast of the grain and give the epoxy a translucent shine. Alright, let's see how it worked out. Perfect fit? Thank you for watching.